And back during Cacophony with a little bit of laid-back 60s cool music. That graceful, relaxing tune tells you you're listening to the Power of Three podcast, the Doctor Who podcast without portfolio that likes to cover everything and anything to do with our favourite television show. I'm Kenny Smith, and today we're taking a look at the latest release from the Black Archive, and this one is number 82, The Daleks, which has been written by Oliver Wake, and he'll be joining us shortly to talk about it. For those of you not in the know, the Black Archive takes an in-depth look at every Doctor Who story, one by one, with different authors, and they present their thoughts, their findings, and everything else. It's not about the behind the scenes, it's very much thematic explorations, as you're about to hear when we speak to the writer of this one. So what more can we tell you about this latest Black Archive? The cover design is another one of Cody Shell's wonderful pieces of distinctive art. You can see there is the silhouette of Barbara with her arms out in a Dalek doorway with the plunger coming towards her, and that's repeated and distorted and twisted, and it just looks wonderful in black, white and grey with splashes of pink as well to give it that distinctive Black Archive look. Brilliant as always. Well done, Cody. The back cover blurb tells us, after the neutronic war, our Dalek forebears retired into the city, protected by our machines. The second Doctor Who serial, The Daleks, 1963-64, establishes both the principle that the Doctor fights alien monsters and the most iconic of those he fights. Oliver Wake looks at its influences from H.G. Wells's The Time Machine through Nazi eugenics to the movies of the atomic era, and at how Terry Nation's script was translated through sound and visual design into perhaps the most important Doctor Who story of all. It's got 200 pages and a cover price of £5.99. So there we go, we've set the scene. Why don't we hear from the writer?
I'm Oliver Wake, and I've written a recent Black Archive monograph about the Daleks, or Serial B, or the Dead Planet, whatever you like to call it. And it came out, in the middle of April.
Fantastic. So, Ollie, you're somebody whose name I have known of for many a year. I used to buy Panic Moon back in the day. And of course, you've also written for DWM.
Well, that takes me back.
Yeah. So Panic Moon was actually, I think it was the last fanzine that I bought. And I've been buying fanzines since the late 80s.
I got into fanzines in the mid-90s, mainly writing for the ones John Connors did, Phase, things like that. And eventually I thought it was time I did my own one. There weren't many left by then. It was about, 2010-ish, when Stephen Moffat took over as the showrunner, and I was very enthusiastic for the series at that point. And I thought it'd be fun to do a fanzine, make a very small one, pocket size. I could just give it away if I went to events, which I never ended up doing. But yeah, it was fun. Went on for a few years, and it was nice to pick up a little bit of a following. And there were some great contributors as well. So the writer and artist. So that was fun. But these things have a lifespan, and it came to an end fairly naturally, I think.
Yeah, it's a shame. I love fanzines, and I think that by doing podcasts, it's my sort of way of having the fanzine ethos, but you can actually hear the spoken words. So.
And I'm blogging at the moment on Doctor Who, so some quite niche articles appearing. But it's the sort of thing I would have put in a fanzine in the past. But now, you don't have to send off your SAE to read it.
And where can people find this blog?
It is called The Hidden Planet, and it's at Substack. So that would mean the address is, and I've got it here, thehiddenplanet.substack.com, if anyone would like to pop along and have a look. It will probably prompt you to subscribe, but you don't have to. Just tell that pop-up to go away. That's fine.
Brilliant. So, the Black Archive. Had you been a reader of them before this one came about, and how did it come about?
Yeah, I've been reading them for a few years. Just on and off, I would dip into the range when one came up that sounded interesting. I don't actually recall when the thought first occurred that I could write one of these, but I'm sure I was thinking, oh, they haven't done one about the Daleks. I wonder why not. That's such an important story. And I think it's an absolutely fascinating story. There's so much there about how it affects Doctor Who, how it was written, the influences behind it, the contemporary situation it reflects regards Cold War paranoia, nuclear weapons, all that sort of stuff. And I thought, well, that'd be perfect for Black Archive. And I thought, well, I could do that. That would have been in 2024, so I dropped a line to one of the editors, Philip Purser-Hallard, and he took me through the process of putting a pitch together, which I did over a few months. I wrote about the first quarter of the book, sent it off in late 2024, and then a few months later I got the go-ahead to do it. So it was written sort of late 2024 into 2025. So it was a while ago now, but it did need a bit of revision, bit of editing, because it is my first attempt at anything that long.
Yeah, I mean, it's an incredible story. It's so adult from the word go, considering Terry Nation had been a comedy writer beforehand.
Absolutely. I mean, he had done sci-fi as well, but he originally set out to be a comedy writer, yes. But he had, I think he said, a foot in both camps, comedy and drama. Which I suppose is a pretty good way to get started in Doctor. I mean, it doesn't have many jokes in the Daleks, to be fair, but a bit of drama and a bit of comedy is no bad thing when you're writing drama.
Very much so. So maybe we could go through the book and pick out some of the highlights, because of course you start with your introduction.
Yes. So, well, let me say first that it's a bit of an unusual structure compared to some of the other Black Archives. Most of them have about 4 or 5 quite substantial chapters, but I've tried to give my book a really brisk pace, given the broad range of subjects I wanted to cover. So rather than having a handful of big chapters, it's got 18 short chapters. And I've got 3 areas of focus across all the chapters. Firstly, I want to look at the origins and inspirations behind the story. Secondly, the mixed authorship of the story and trying to untangle who contributed what. And then thirdly, analysing it and its world building as a piece of fantasy fiction. Now, those areas sort of overlap in different chapters, but broadly across the 18 chapters, those are the 3 things I'm trying to get at. Now, as there's 18 chapters, I won't list all of them. That would take forever. But, for example, early on in the book, there's a sort of a cluster of 3 chapters which look at the nuclear angle. So this, for example, a section about the history of, or not quite the history, but the situation regarding nuclear weapons at the point Terry Nation was writing, and about the neutron bomb, which was very topical at the time, and which he's introduced, I think, for thematic reasons more than anything, because he doesn't use it in a scientifically accurate way. And I look at the other sort of film, TV, and literature dealing with nuclear issues at the time to kind of put the Daleks in sort of context of that. And then how it works has almost a treatise on the dangers of nuclear weapons, really a warning against them, and how it takes the concept of survival as its central theme. And then I'll talk about how it almost can be viewed as a part of a thematic pair with an unearthly child. So both concern survival, and they both concern technology, but in completely opposite types of society. So in an unearthly child, you've got a very primitive society, and fire is their initial technology that they're after. And then obviously in the Daleks, you've got a really high-tech society, and they've had nuclear weapons, and that's caused devastation. So I think that's quite an interesting angle, actually, that you can view the two together. Anyway, I won't go off on one about that, but so that's all covered in the book. One of the chapters I was particularly pleased with is about the music and the sound effects, because I think the sound design by Tristan Carey and Brian Hodgson really enhances the story. And I'd argue that it actually uses ambiguity of sound really constructively and deliberately to create an intriguing and uncanny atmosphere. For example, sometimes it's unclear whether certain sounds you're hearing are actually music, sound effects, or just general acoustics. And in fact, as a viewer or even listener, your perception of what they are changes at times within the story, which I think is very clever. And we perhaps don't give it enough kudos for that.
And I think the timing of that, especially with the current issue of Doctor Who magazine, with that amazing feature on Brian Hodgson, works out really, really well.
Yes, that was quite handy, yeah. There's one chapter which is quite a lengthy one called The Mutants, where I look at the backstory of the Daleks and the Thals and how they have mutated, because we don't actually get told all that much about it in the story, but there are a lot of clues you can read from the scripts, from the rehearsal scripts, and in the production documentation that the BBC have retained. But I explore where some of those ideas come from, particularly around the Thals. And I think you can see a connection between the Thals and the Mutos in Genesis of the Daleks, with them both having a common origin in one of Terry Nation's earlier sci-fi dramas for ITV. So I thought that was quite an interesting angle. And then on the Daleks themselves, it's interesting when you look into it and look at the interviews of all the various people who worked on the story, that none of them quite agree on the state of the Dalek mutation, what they actually look like inside their machines. And I think that's why there are some sort of logical contradictions within the story, which is a shame, but it's probably because they were all working very quickly, I suspect. But again, I look at the behind the scenes documentation, the draft scripts, or not drafts, rehearsal scripts rather, to try and get an idea of what they were aiming for.
Yeah, the thing that I was really fascinated by the research you've done there to have a look at Terry Nation's previous work with Out of This World and Imposter, which there's just so much in that. Just incredible the influence it has on the Thals, which I am going to have to go and listen to on the Out of This World DVD.
Yes, absolutely do so. It's fascinating, and you'll see there's dialogue in there which is listed almost exactly for Genesis of the Daleks. Not quite exactly, but people saying basically the same things. So that features, for the benefit of the listener. The Mutos from Genesis of the Daleks basically started life in this 1962 TV play. And some of the dialogue there, there are things like, all Normans must die, or words to that effect, and, dialogue about how they were created by I think it's the lingering radiological effects in Imposter, whereas it's from chemical weapons in Genesis, but it's all broadly the same stuff. But they introduce in there the idea of a cyclical mutation, and that the Mutos in Imposter are coming around full circle. They're going to end up looking human again. And basically that's the backstory to the Thals, is that they mutated and now they're back looking human again. So I think that's quite fascinating. He's taken the idea which he devised in 1962 to basically to pad out a Philip K. Dick story. He develops it then into the Thals for Doctor Who, and then later revisits it again and goes back to the Mutos for Genesis of the Daleks.
That's incredible.
Yeah, I think there's lots of little things like that when you start delving into old TV, that you find little connections that have perhaps eluded people until now. But I did actually have the pleasure some years ago of doing an article in one of the DWM specials about Imposter, but I'm not sure that was very well known. But I did go to the BFI as well when writing the book, because they've got telesnaps for almost that entire series, and it's a real shame that they aren't published. One of the chapters is called Gender and Authority, and here I look at how sexist the Thal society is presented and their methods of leadership, which I then contrast with the Daleks. While there's not much to be said about gender in respect to the Daleks, the question of authority and leadership is more interesting. In later stories, the Daleks will always have a clear leader, but here in the Daleks, it looks like they've got a fairly equal society. There are hints even that they've got a ruling council, and that was something that was more explicit in Nation's draft. So I argue that actually at this point, the Daleks aren't the authoritarians that we'll see later. They're not quite democratic, but they are, it's not an authoritarian dictatorship kind of structure. There's lots of stuff in the book about H.G. Wells. It is well known that Terry Nation was inspired by The Time Machine, and I argue that it's actually mainly the film version that he's inspired by. And there's even points where there are equivalent scenes in The Daleks and The Time Machine. And there's also a chapter looking at what he borrowed from Wells' The War of the Worlds as well, because the Daleks are a similar concept to the Martian war machines in that. But I also look in that chapter at a short story by John Wyndham, from which I think Nation borrowed some plot mechanics again, and possibly some inspiration for the Daleks again. I won't give away which story I'm referring to here. The listener will have to buy the book for that.
Something that I was fascinated by is just how much you've got on the Thals, particularly looking at the the Aryan element of them and the pacifism as well.
Yes, there is a lot about the Thals. There's the whole chapter about termination and pacifism and how he identified as a pacifist, but possibly a slightly wobbly one by the sounds of things, and how that is sort of interpreted into the Thals, and their pacifism doesn't quite work on screen because they have to get over it, basically. And if they were that solidly pacifist for 500 years or whatever, it's hard to believe that one argument would really sway them. But it's an interesting aspect. I mean, looking at where Terry Nation's pacifism comes from, his experience in the Second World War, things like that. And yes, the Aryan aspect. I read a book about that and all the the racist conceptions behind it. So there's a little bit about that in the book, and trying to work out why they would have used that basically very racially charged stereotype for the Thals. And I think it is intended more innocently than it could be interpreted today, basically.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's fascinating for a book that's about the Daleks. The Thals play such a part in it. I mean, they're not mentioned that often, really, post Planet of the Daleks and Genesis, but obviously Big Finish have tapped into them. But it's a fascinating sort of contrast between the Daleks and the Thals that way.
And I think something to remember is the story was originally conceived as the Mutants. That's the Mutants plural. I mean, it's because there are two races of mutants on the planet. It's not just about the Daleks. And obviously the Daleks is the big thing it bequeathed Doctor Who, but it's easy to forget that it wasn't about creating a big successful alien race to use again. It was just another adventure, and it was about this conflict of two different species, or in fact it's about survival and the two different paths to survival that these species have taken. The high-tech Daleks and the low-tech Thals going off and farming on the other side of the planet or wherever it is. And the Thals really are 50% of the story. It's only later that they get dropped pretty quickly when it's clear it's the Daleks that everyone cares about.
Yeah, I particularly liked, following on from that, when you're tapping into Chapter 14, the outer space robot people, and making the point that the Daleks are referred to as people. They are very clearly, they are not monsters. And from what you said, just that you said there, they were never conceived as that. It's fascinating just to have that explored in full.
And the dialogue in the Daleks, for the Daleks, is rather chatty. They sit around having conversations with each other in ways that they won't do in future, because they are equals here, and they are a people, not just robotic monsters. But if you look at the rehearsal scripts, they're even chattier there and have very human dialogue. They say things like, "That won't do." It was Richard Martin, who gets a really bad rap as a director, but one of his things he did do here is reining in that kind of dialogue. And he said he wanted them to be more zombie-like, but that's the origin of their method of speaking. So although it's not complete within the Daleks, he did a lot to shift their dialogue in the direction we now know. And in that chapter, I also like to look at the idea of the Daleks as space Nazis, because it's often said, Terry Nation conceived them as the Nazis. Well, no, he didn't. When you look at this story, they become space Nazis in the next story, in the Dalek Invasion of Earth, when they've got to go out conquering other worlds, or attempting to. But here, really, they are fascistic in certain respects, but primarily they're scared, jealous survivalists. They're people who think they're stuck in their bunker forevermore. They're not out conquering the universe.
I particularly was interested in the next chapter. We were going into hideous machine-like creatures, and you have some brilliant chapter titles here.
Thank you.
They just absolutely perfect. If you know your classic Doctor Who, you'll see where so many of these come from. But I thought this was fantastic. It's something that your people talk about, but here you really do go into the influences in Dalek design.
Yes, the idea is that we know all the stories about, are they going to make them out of fiberglass or wood and all that sort of thing. But what I was interested in is actually, firstly, what creative decisions made them the shapes they were, and also in what ways and why do they reflect certain early 20th century design trends. I went down a bit of a rabbit hole there, lots of books and all sorts of things. And I will say, if any listeners do find themselves buying the book, if you go to my blog, you'll see there's a post on there where I have put a load of images which can be viewed as almost the separate illustrations to this chapter of the book, because the book is just text, but the blog's got all the illustrations to show some of the design icons I've referred to there.
I think particularly the stuff when you're talking about the art's modern or streamline modern, that's something that I was aware of because my dad was always interested in that sort of period of design. And just sort of seeing how sort of Daleks tap into that sort of period.
And that was all new to me. I was aware that there was a sort of an Art Deco style to the Daleks. So it was when I started digging into that, I discovered streamlined modern as a particular type of Art Deco. And I had great fun with that, looking at all sorts of books at the library for all the illustrations I could find, that kind of thing. So actually, it's a good point that writing this book, obviously I go into it thinking I know a lot, but doing the research is really one of the fun bits of it, actually learning so much more, and not just about Doctor Who, but about these ancillary aspects, things I would never have thought to look up before, like 1930s design movements. So that was, very interesting.
There's actually a building in Glasgow on the way to Glasgow Airport, which is of a very similar, it's in that Art Deco look. It used to be a light bulb factory, and it's been converted into flats very sympathetically. It's been brilliantly done, but it very much ties in. And I was reading this and just thinking, yep, I can see that sort of correlation there between what you're talking about in the book and the real life thing. I suppose that's the thing when you're doing this research, as you say, you can almost go down rabbit holes when you discover something new.
Yeah, absolutely. The next chapter is one I was very keen on. That's called Direction of the Daleks. I couldn't think of a better title than that, to be honest. I would argue that the success of the story is down largely to the directors. And I could have written thousands of words about that. That's a particular fascination of mine is television direction in the 1960s. But frankly, there wasn't space to write thousands of words, so it's a relatively short chapter. And I've concentrated specifically on how the directors Christopher Barry and Richard Martin influenced the audience's perception of the Daleks themselves through blocking, framing, and guiding the performers to make the Daleks appear a credible alien threat. And that's something I don't think we talk about enough, is that the Daleks are, in some stories, they're kind of very static and quite uninteresting to look at, and it's direction that changes, and it's the direction that made them so interesting and threatening in that first story.
Particularly given that the props themselves are shorter, and there's some of the angles that are used to give them that height and menace.
Absolutely.
There's the point you make earlier about Richard Martin. I mean, very much, well, some may not be so impressed by some of his actual direction, perhaps in Dalek Invasion of Earth. It's the angles, just step back from that and look at the way he actually shoots the Daleks, because it's very, very clever.
Yes, and you might argue that he learned that from Christopher Barry, who started the Daleks. So Christopher Barry, for example, has the scene where the Doctor is interrogated, and they make him sit in a spotlight, and then they show the Daleks from a low angle. So they are towering over him, and he's made to look smaller than them as well, because he's been made to sit down, which is something I don't think you'll ever see that again in Doctor Who. It's actually the Dalek telling someone to sit on the floor, basically because they want to tower over him and intimidate him, I think. So I think that's a very clever decision, and maybe Richard Martin picks up on that from Christopher Barry. But one of the ironies is that this was one of Richard Martin's very first bits of TV, if not the first, I can't quite remember. And it's been suggested that he was put on it and sharing duties with Christopher Barry, so Christopher Barry could be a bit of more of an experienced hand guiding him. Yet Christopher Barry technically was still a PA at this point. Richard Martin was, although fresh off the director's course, he was employed as a director, whereas Christopher Martin was the production assistant, just occasionally being allowed to direct. But he's certainly very good, and he does have some experience.
Yeah, you can really see it. I mean, we've seen it with recovered master plan episodes.
Oh yes, it's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, just the way that Douglas Camfield shoots them, again in a different way, where the Daleks are always kinetic. There's never there's always part of them moving, whether it's slightly moving on the spot, or the eye stalk twitching, the dome rotating slightly, or one of the gun stick or the arm moving. There's always something about them.
And it makes such a difference. It really sells them as an alien race. I mean, the argument I make is when you look at people sat or standing in a room, nobody is absolutely totally immobile. They're always shifting their head, their eyes, shifting your feet a little bit, that sort of thing. And that's kind of what the Daleks do when Douglas Camfield is directing them. But also, there's a lot of that with the Christopher Barry stuff in the Daleks. I think that an absolutely brilliant shot is the one where early in episode 2, the Daleks are first seen in full. The camera pulls back, and the Daleks sort of crowd in from both sides of the screen, and their arms are twitching, the domes are moving. They aren't just there static, waiting to be discovered by the camera. They're moving. And I think it's, again, it really sells them as something interesting to look at, and as, I could say people, not people, but creatures, I suppose. And as I put in the book, something almost insectoid about them in the way they twitch their arms like ants or something, has twitching antenna.
That's very fair. I think that there's something disconcerting about them when they're actually moving but doing nothing. I think that's the sort of, it shows they're alive. It's not just an empty casing, as we may later have seen in Death to the Daleks, for example, just to make up numbers in the background.
Yes, and even there are some stories where the props are occupied. They're the hero props, but they're not doing anything. They're still just standing there, which really I think is a real shame. But yes, let's not worry about that now. Let's talk about the Daleks, where they look brilliant.
Absolutely. I love the fact that Chapter 17 goes into the whole extermination then, and it's just showing how that myth that kids were shouting exterminate in the playground, and you make reference to an adventure in space and time as part of that, from the word go, but it's incredible. It's not there straight away. It's something, it's not really till the chase that they probably start going into that sort of like the cliche that we've come to know and love.
Exactly. It's a very discursive chapter, that one, and it's inspired by an observation that Simon Gurrier made in his biography of David Whittaker, which is very good, and I'd recommend that to your listeners. He mentions that the first person to use the word exterminate in connection with the Daleks was David Whittaker when summarising the plan seal in an internal BBC document. And in my chapter, I firstly look at what the word really means and how it's used in the story. And in fact, while it would later be used just as a synonym for kill, it's actually used more technically correctly in Daleks. But also, I look at who made it a Dalek catchphrase. So we don't get exterminate shouted in the Daleks. But what's interesting is there are a few instances of it in the rehearsal script, but there's more in the actual final version, which suggests that either maybe David Whittaker is the script editor or possibly one of the directors thought that's a good word or that sounds good when the Dalek said it and added some more in. And then you see exactly that in the Dalek Invasion of Earth. It's not in Terry Nation's draft scripts at all. So Terry Nation doesn't use it in the Dalek Invasion of Earth, but it is there in the story. So it's been added in when David Whittaker was revising his drafts. And again, there are more uses of it on screen than even in the camera script, I think. So you can see people are picking up on it saying, yeah, that sounds good. Let's have more of that. Then when Terry Nation writes the chase, he starts putting in, and there's a lot of it at the end of the Dalek Invasion of Earth. So what I think happened, and that would be just before Terry Nation was writing the chase. So I think he's watched his latest story go out and thought, well, yeah, this word exterminate, that works. And he's picked it up and actually made it the catchphrase then for the chase, but only after David Whittaker and others have been putting it into the earlier story. But basically, I'll go into I'll go into a lot more detail in the book. But it's fascinating when you also look at the film of the Daleks, which was being made at the same time as the chase. I mean, the word's in there, I think, twice. But again, by the time they come to do the second film, there's a lot more of it in there. So it is definitely around the time of the chase that everyone's realising, right, this is going to be the Daleks catchphrase. So it really takes two stories to get there.
It's definitely better than delete.
Yes, absolutely.
Because I'm one of those sort of fans who likes titles and things like that. You look at the story title.
Oh, I love titles.
Oh, exactly. The story title for this hand, of course, you can also tap into Dalek, and it really is a complete exploration of all of those things that people like me that love the Black Archive just want to read about. And it's fascinating just from the word go. You do look through the various titles and then tap into the Terry Nation myths. So this must be good fun to do.
Yes, well, the titles and the Dalek are slightly separate bits. We've got a bit about at the start about the different trends for naming this serial, just to get out of the way the fact that people have called it about 3 or 4 different things over the years. But then Dalek is about really how the various characters and species came to be named in the scripts and what nations, or in some cases David Whittaker's inspirations would have been. But I also suggest a new potential origin for the word Dalek in that John Wyndham story that I mentioned earlier. That may be controversial. It may not convince everyone, but it's a theory anyway. The reader can accept it or not as they choose. But I love that sort of stuff, story titles and where words come from, what they mean to people, where they've borrowed from, all that sort of thing.
Even tapping into things, again, mentioning the thous again, with being the German word for valley, all that kind of thing. It's it's interesting just to see it brought together in one place, because I think that's the thing that when you've read Doctor Who magazine for as long as we have, and you have all these wonderful articles in different places throughout, and what you've done is obviously you've got your own research, other people's theories and pulling it together into one place. And I think that is the absolute beauty of the Black Archive, because, my God, it makes you think.
It certainly does, yeah. And it's great fun to write as well.
How's the research process for you? Is that one that you quite enjoy doing, or is it something that can be quite difficult to fit around real life and everything else?
Yeah, both really. I really enjoy it. It's great fun, but it takes a very long time. My approach is I want to know everything I possibly can. So when starting off this book, I did have an idea of doing this one or possibly another one. I would mention both to the publisher, but I went for this one in the end. And I did start to think at one point, was that a mistake? Because if you're going to try and read everything around a particular subject, well, what in Doctor Who has there been a lot written about? Well, the Daleks, the early stories, Terry Nation. I mean, so I tracked down every interview with Terry Nation I could find, every interview with the directors, with Verity Lambert. I read up all sorts of newspaper clippings. Went to the BBC Written Archive Centre to look at the original files, all that sort of thing. Got hold of the rehearsal scripts, and it's fascinating stuff, but it's very difficult to keep track of that much stuff. So my document of research notes was almost as long as the book itself in the end. But it is fun, but it does take a long time. And there are times where you think, well, I've done it all, I'm going to start writing. And it's like, oh no, I haven't researched X and Y. So then it's back to the drawing board to do that before carrying on again. And even quite late in the process. Well, the other thing with Doctor, of course, is people are publishing things about it every day, whether it's articles in DWM, on blogs and podcasts coming out. So trying to keep abreast of anything that might be relevant as well. So I'm sure I irritated the editors by asking for some last minute edits, like, oh, so-and-so has just dug up X and Y, let's add this in and add that in. So yes, that was quite a challenge, but it is good fun, and I do like the research. And some of it I couldn't use, so I ended up so anyone who wants to look at the blog will find there's a few articles on there about the Daleks which use that research that I couldn't use in the book. So it all finds home eventually.
Very much so. And just looking through the bibliography, it's rather comprehensive, because you can see you really have done your work.
Yeah,
looking through old fanzines.
Oh yeah, lots of old fanzines. Yeah, and we had to cut down the bibliography as well. It would have been a lot. Well, the book wouldn't have fit the page count. So there's a lot more stuff that could have gone in there. So I looked at hundreds of things, and for the nuclear section, I read a dozen old books about nuclear war and things like that, which was a jolly time, I can tell you. Interesting, but it got me down a bit. But yeah, so a lot of reading went into it, but it's all very interesting stuff.
I would imagine that when you were writing this, you would have had on the Dalek soundtrack just for background, just to keep you in the zone.
Actually, I didn't a lot of the time, no, but I did obviously listen through to it when writing about the music. But the trouble with the soundtrack is that it's not background music when there's sudden mechanical crashes on the soundtrack every now and then. I think that might have kicked me out of what I was looking at suddenly to be jump out my skin while I'm writing.
Now, of course, something I always ask our guests is to, hypothetically, if you were to do another one, if this experience hasn't drained you, then if you could do another one, is there any particular story you'd like to do?
Well, I'm working on another one at the moment, actually. So that's
well, we better not tell us that.
And I don't know if I'm allowed to say or not yet. So yes, I'll better keep tight-lipped on that, I'm afraid. But what I can say is, I think you have to really not like a story, but you have to really find it fascinating and really want to pull it apart to do one of these. There are stories I love which I wouldn't want to dissect in this way, and yet actually there are some stories I don't much like, but it would be a really fascinating exercise to pull those scripts apart and understand where, in my view, perhaps they went wrong, and what they were aiming for, even if they didn't achieve it. But you've really got to want to do that to get into the nitty-gritty of the story. And I can think of about half a dozen that I would potentially be interested in doing, if the opportunity arises. But who knows whether that'll happen. We'll have to, see how this one goes down and the next one. And then what other things I'm working on meanwhile, because these do take a lot of work.
Absolutely. So to quote from John Nathan Turner, stay tuned.
Exactly, yes. Can I just say, I should give a shout out to the book's editor, Philip Purser-Hallard, who was excellent. He really helped me through the process as, the first lengthy bit of non-fiction I've written, and I'm sure I annoyed him, with lots of queries and last-minute revisions and things like that. And the whole team at Obverse, really. I mean, there's several editors there, and most of them have had, input at some point, whether it was proofreading or various editorial suggestions. And although at times you think, oh, don't make me cut that joke, the final product is definitely the better for all that input of other people. So I appreciate that greatly.
very much so. Editors are so underrated.
Yes, absolutely.
And working with the right team, you can get far better results. So
Absolutely.
I know that. Fantastic. Ollie, thank you so much for taking the time to come on and talk about the Daleks, which is available now from Obverse Books.
Thanks, Kenny. It's been good fun.
Fantastic stuff. Huge thanks to Ollie again. Now, if you want to order a copy, head over to www.obverseBooks.co.uk/82-the-Daleks/ and the link will be in the show notes as always. Coming up also this year from the Black Archive, the next release is out this month. It's The Web Planet by Bridget Cherry. Then in August it's The Invasion from Steve Hatcher, who's a lovely fella, know him. And in October it's Frontios from Paul Driscoll. So there's a good mix of stories with different doctors on the way for the rest of the year. And of course, the Black Archive has just published a special release on An Adventure in Space and Time. And hopefully we'll be having a discussion about that one on this podcast before too long. If you've enjoyed today's episode, feel free to leave a review wherever you get your podcasts from, as we haven't had one in ages, and they are always appreciated. You can follow us on social media. We have a Facebook group, we have Twitter at Power of 3 Pod, and we also have Blue Sky, where we are at Finished Zine. And you can also find the latest episodes of Pieces of Eighth on there as well, if you're a fan of the Eighth Doctor, where you can join myself and Matt Michael chatting all things McGann. Now, it's time to head off, and we definitely need a bit of music to play out with, and I think it would be appropriate to go with something a bit Dalek-y. However, we're not going to go with anything obvious like music from the show or anything like that, and Murray Gold's choral themes. Let's go with a piece of music called Dance of the Daleks, which was written by Jack Dorsey. Not the guy who founded Twitter. Oh, come back, Jack, all is forgiven. Until next time, I've been Kenny Smith, and this is the Dance of the Daleks.